Hello and welcome. The BeDuhn Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week, our guest is Dr. Jason BeDuhn, a professor of religious studies at Northern Arizona University. In this episode, we discuss the history of Manichaeism, exploring its dualistic cosmology and its connections to various religious traditions, including Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Platonism. The challenges Manichaeism faced, including its eventual decline due to persecution in both the West and the East, and archaeological discoveries related to Manichaeism, particularly in Egypt and China. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Well, I want to thank you, first of all, for joining me this morning, or at least morning for me. And I want to start us off and ask you, how did you get into your field?
Well, thanks so much for having me. Like many people who got their beginning education in America, I mainly knew Persia as like a foil to ancient Greece. And then as things moved on in history, the map shifts over to the West and the Iranian world is kind of forgotten. But I was very fortunate that as I was working on my college career doing religious studies, I ended up in Harvard in the 80s and met up with Richard Fry, the Aga Khan professor of Iranian studies at Harvard at the time. And it was very timely for me because I was getting a little restless working on the early history of Christianity, and my broader exposure to the Iranian world, was very fortuitous because I got interested in studying the Manichaeans, who were an important religious group that formed in what the time was Iranian-ruled Mesopotamia under an original Jewish and Christian impetus, but very much then acculturated to Mesopotamia and Iran. And so it looked very different from sort of Mediterranean Christianity and how it developed. And so that then became the big kickstart to where my career has gone since then. Most of my work has been about the Manichaeans or using the Manichaeans as a way to look back at the development of Christianity from a different angle and to bring in the Asian world, bring in the Iranian world as a key factor, not only in the development of Manichaeism and Christianity, but also in the ways that the sort of unique properties of Iran as a kind of crossroads of cultures cause a lot of other sort of key developments of late antique religious culture, including, I've argued, really the first formation of the idea of religion as a separate identity from ethnicity and culture and so forth. And Iran just seemed to be in the right place at the right time to make that jump to the way we tend to think of religion today as a distinct thing from, one's birth and one's ethnicity and customs and so forth. And that was in part due to the very cosmopolitan nature of the Iranian world at the time. So, for the last, 30 years or so, I've been working in this area, sometimes, directly focused on Iran, sometimes doing comparative things that bring Iran and other Iranian traditions into the mix. And so it's been very fruitful for me, and I've really enjoyed it.
I mean, it's fascinating, and I have to confess that I really had never heard of Manichaeism before honestly hearing about your work. And I'm not familiar with how many people may or may not have heard of it before who listen to this show. So I was hoping that you could go a bit deeper and sort of tell us, like, okay, we know where it is now, but like, where did it start? Where did it develop from? Like, why is it so important that we study them now in context, not just because of geography?
Yeah, well, you're in very good company because most people haven't heard of Manichaeism. Those who have usually heard about it because they know that St. Augustine of Hippo, very important early Christian theologian, started his religious life as a Manichaean and was a Manichaean for a decade before he converted to Catholicism. And so most people have heard of Manichaeans through that as a kind of foil to the religion he becomes. And even for Augustine, it was a matter of he drew away from Manichaeism, talking about it as a as a foreign religion, as an alien religion, something that had come from the East, that had come from outside the Roman Empire. But to explain Manichaeism a little more fully, it is in fact an offshoot of the Christian movement. The Christian movement still in its Jewish phase, moving along channels and networks of Jewish communities from Judea into Babylonia, where there were probably more Jews in Babylonia at the time than there were in Judea at the time of the early formation of Christianity. And Christianity, as most people know, is very diverse to start with, a lot of different forms of it. And each form was adapting to a different local cultural circumstance and background. When Christianity would meet different populations, when the Christian movement would meet different populations, it would seek to connect to where people were in their prior culture, in their prior religion, in their prior education. And so when the Christian movement travels east outside of the Roman Empire and goes into what at the time was first Parthian and then a Persian territory, there were populations there that were receptive to it. And Manichaeism then formed in that environment. It formed out of the impetus of a founding figure, Mani, or Manichaeos, who is the religion is named after. And of course, like almost all religions, it's named after him first by outsiders who are trying to find a name for this other form of religion than their own. And we're talking the early 3rd century in this region. And so it's right at the transition from the Arsacid Parthian rule to Sassanid Persian rule. And he kind of leads the way in acculturating the Christian message to the Mesopotamian and Iranian religious background, which include such things as dualism. So Manichaeism is a dualistic religion that sees good and evil as completely alien and originally separate from each other. And so at the very beginnings of the universe, there were two completely separate realities. And then in a process that Manichaeans could either describe in a sort of, quasi-scientific manner or in a kind of mythological manner, these two worlds of good and evil collide and enter into conflict. And our world then is a product of that. And what we experienced in our world of the mixture of good and evil in everything is a product of that accident or crisis in the universe that brings good and evil together. So through that kind of dualistic story, Manichaeism provides a background to then the teachings of Jesus and the particular interpretation of those teachings that Manichaeism offered, which is that our mission in life is to support the good, resist the evil, distance ourselves from evil, extract ourselves from evil, deal with the mixture of good and evil in ourselves, first and foremost, and a series of disciplinary practices and a series of ritual practices that are meant to separate good and evil, using a kind of root metaphor of light and darkness for that. And so to separate light from darkness within ourselves and within the world around us, leading to a kind of apocalyptic liberation of light from darkness that restores the universe to its original state, where there's a realm of complete good, which we should identify with and should hope to be in the end when that happens. So Manichaeism then, starting in the 3rd century, becomes very quickly a very energetic missionary movement. And that's why Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century is able to be exposed to it and belong to it for a while. So it spread across North Africa. There were big Manichaean communities in Egypt, from which we've recovered Coptic texts. They were in Roman North Africa, Algeria and Tunisia area, where we've recovered, a couple of Latin texts. And then they also spread deeper into Asia. So they were obviously in Mesopotamia and Iran. They spread into Armenia. They spread into Central Asia and had reached China by the 7th century. But they were often persecuted. They often did not have the fortune to win over the state support. And other religions did, and so the other religions turned state backing against the Manichaeans. And so there's a long history of ups and downs, of brief periods of flourishing, followed by periods of persecution. And Manichaeism, gradually loses the competition to other religions. So it kind of dies out in the West, and its place is taken by Orthodox and Catholic Christianity and by Islam in Iran itself. Zoroastrianism is really coming into its own as a distinct tradition at the same time. And then the one time the Manichaeans had state support was from the Uyghurs in Central Asia. And so the Uyghurs had a very large steppe empire, and the leadership converted to Manichaeism. And the Uyghurs, even after that empire broke up and smaller Uyghur kingdoms existed, they continued to favor Manichaeism for a few hundred years. And then the last traces of Manichaeism that survive are in China. And we continue, even in recent decades, to find new Manichaean texts, including new Chinese sources that are coming up recently. So all told, it's over 1,000 years of Manichaean history. And so it's probably the biggest of the lost religions, the one with the most historical footprint of all the extinct religions, but it does not exist anymore.
I mean, it's incredible. I mean, just hearing you talk about this long history and, as you were talking sort of more about its dualistic cosmology, one of the things that I was kind of thinking about was, yeah, it really sounds like Mani's teachings sort of combine a lot of the teachings from like certain other religions is the impression I got because I was like, well, I feel like I hear echoes of like Platonism and Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Judaism. There's even probably some aspect, especially as a religion that was in the third century. I mean, there's still what like mystery cults and sort of ancient pagan stuff still going on. And so it's interesting because if it combines,
Mhm.
if it sounds like it combines a lot of teachings and other tenets of all these different things, I wonder, is it possible that maybe one of the reasons it didn't really latch on to more than one state with the Uyghurs and continue on because it was trying to combine too much? Because I'm like thinking of like all these other very well established ancient religions that did get either state support or spread around, like Judaism and Christianity and Zoroastrianism. But like they kind of stick to like the one sort of doctrine and they don't really kind of try to incorporate all these other things. So I'm wondering, is it possible that like is that contribute to it dying out because maybe it tried to take on too many characteristics and then it got a bit too muddled, or is that completely wrong?
Well, actually, what you're saying is something that's been said in the scholarship on Manichaeism for a long time. A word that's often tossed out in reference to Manichaeism is syncretism. And syncretism is used to refer to something that looks to be kind of a hybrid of different original traditions. And the word has some uses, but those uses run out to a certain point because really every religious tradition involves the amalgamation of originally distinct components. It's just that at some point they kind of solidify into a facade of unity that gives the kinds of impressions you were just describing for, oh, well, this tradition is, very well established and stable and has a very clear, distinct identity. And that is a historical process of achieving that. And you may be right that Manichaeism, its particular way of handling that process of integrating and coordinating different sources of influence was kind of a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it made them very successful initially in their missionary work because there was a very self-conscious effort to go to a new area, examine its religious tradition, try to find very explicit connections to what the Manichaeans were trying to say that would sound familiar to that new culture. And so that initially was a very successful strategy for winning people over and spreading the religion very quickly. But its adaptability, its willingness to, say, for example, rename the deities in its pantheon based on which culture it was in, connecting them to familiar gods of that culture, might have weakened its unity as a tradition across, thousands of miles, and also made it more prone to kind of sink into the cultures that it had moved into and not as you were suggesting, not necessarily maintaining its distinct identity very strongly in the face of its interest in acculturating wherever it went. And the founder of Manichaeism, Mani, seems to have been very deliberate and self-conscious about this approach to other religions. He believed, from what he described as revelations he had received, however we as historians interpret that, that there had been predecessors all over the world throughout history. It sounds very similar to what Islam teaches, right? That every nation receives a prophet and so forth. And So the Manichaeans were talking about this before Islam arose, of course, but they were suggesting that indeed you could look at any culture and find traces of that original pure true revelation. But Mani and the Manichaean said, but it's been corrupted, right? Through transmission, it's been altered and changed and made more convenient for worldly purposes, and so you have to recover that. And so Mani believed that he could find that common denominator in all world religions, and that was he was trying to reestablish that. But it is a bit of a juggling act with all these moving parts. And one of the questions we have, because we cannot interview living Manichaeans, is how much some of the teachings of Manichaeism were really things of popular concern, or whether they were just things for sort of the scribal elites to puzzle over and work on, and what the more popular form of Manichaeism might have looked like, might have not had the same complex impression as we have when we find these intellectual texts from the tradition that might have been really only sort of, like picking up the most elite philosophical texts from a tradition. It's not necessarily what the religion looks like in the broader face of it in the public eye. So we have a lot of questions about exactly what impressions Manichaeism gave to people, why they were attracted to it, what they saw and valued in it, and the big question, why it lost the competition, why it became extinct. That's a really hard question to pin down. It might have been a series of very local circumstances that just sort of stacked up over time, but grand explanations for why a religion succeeds or fails might be very dangerous ground to tread on.
Totally understandable. I mean, I'm sure it's a very, very complex question. So, anything that sort of helps us maybe understand the factors, I think is pretty good.
Definitely.
One thing I did want to ask was, so we've talked about money a little bit now, and I want to dig a little deeper into that. So obviously different religions have different, very distinct progenitors who's and they're like, okay, well, we're going to just attribute the whole thing to this person. And obviously, each religion considers their progenitor sort of in a different role, whether it's Christianity and you have Jesus as, the Son of God, or you have a more Islamic version of, Muhammad, he's a prophet, or if you have like Judaism, you're like, okay, well, we have Abraham, but like he was just a favored man. And so for Mani, what would have he like would he have been considered more of a prophet, like a Jesus figure? Yeah, like what exactly do they make of this progenitor of this particular religion?
Right. Well, that's a terrific question. And it's one that's been receiving a lot of attention recently because, as in all of the religions you referenced, right, we have the problem of the historical Mani, just like we have the problem of the historical Jesus, the historical Buddha, and so forth. So Mani may have had one self-conception, but his followers then altered that image of him. So, well, the one thing we know absolutely for sure about Mani is his preferred title for himself was Apostle of Jesus Christ, right? So one of our colleagues in the field, Zsuzsanna Gulaci, demonstrated that a crystal seal that is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris with an image of Mani and then an inscription around it, Mani, the Apostle of Jesus Christ, was actually the seal that he used to authenticate his writings. When he finished a letter, he would seal the letter by stamping this seal into it. And this was at least one of the seals that he used for that. And so that was the identity he most preferred to go by. And when he wrote letters, he would always address them as, I, Mani, the Apostle of Jesus Christ, to you, and so forth. So he certainly saw himself as continuing what Jesus started, as subordinate in some way to Jesus in that way. As the tradition develops, however, he gets elevated to a kind of co-equal, not only with Jesus, but with the Buddha, with Zarathustra, with other major founding figures. And so eventually the Manichaeans develop a kind of what we loosely call prophetology, in which there are these major messengers of God in history that are believed to have all taught the same thing. And Mani was simply the latest, most recent sort of reviver of that message. And so people, sing hymns to him, they make prayers to him. They believe that once a year he descends from the moon to spiritually occupy a vacant throne, to kind of renew the community. And so he's elevated to, it's not really divine status. These are human messengers of God, but their souls have kind of been prepared before their life, sort of before incarnation. They've been prepared to come into the world and take on this role of a messenger of God, and they lead mortal lives, and they die mortal deaths, and then in the future, another one will come, right? And so this is believed to be a chain of messengers from God, that Mani is simply was believed by the Manichaeans to be the most recent and perhaps the last one.
That's truly fascinating. I do love learning and hearing about, yeah, what did certain people think of the progenitors of their religion? And especially I feel like that becomes more and more relevant if, as the case you mentioned somewhere in the beginning, that you're trying to make a distinction really between ethnicity and religion as being significant markers for, creating your own community. And so
Right.
I would definitely say, like the progenitor of a religion that creates a community is very different from the ethnic, like the first ethnic person from a different community. And so it's fascinating. And I definitely would love to learn and hear more about that. But one thing I did want to jump to was, as we were speaking about all this, one of the reasons that a lot of religions are able to spread are through written word, especially later in time. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of different religions use a lot of different languages as their language of religion, whether it's Latin or ancient Greek. And so I was just wondering, like, kind of a two-parter. I mean, this spread around, and obviously geographically, they don't all speak the same thing, but was there sort of one central language they used as the language of this religion? One, and then two, how accessible did they want to make it? So, like, could everyone read, or did you have to be able to read to be able to participate, or did they say you don't really need that? We'll just teach you the stuff and you can do it.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, because it comes to a key point about Manichaeism and the critique the Manichaeans had of prior religions is that their founders did not write, right? So they'd say the Buddha taught things, but he didn't write anything down, and so his disciples could change it. Jesus taught things, he didn't write anything down, so his disciples could change it. So this may go back to Mani, this idea that Mani is going to make a difference. He's going to write books. And he did. And we know he wrote books. And so that's sort of held up as he's taking greater efforts so that the teachings are not lost or changed. And so writing and bookmaking became very important in Manichaean culture. But as part of this worldwide sort of missionary strategy, they already in Mani's own lifetime, the decision was made to translate. Wherever you go, translate. So Mani himself was speaking an Eastern Aramaic dialect, and that he was brought up with. But already while he was still alive, he arranged to have a special book composed in Middle Persian so that the Sassanid king could read it, right? Or have it read to him, as the case may be, in his own language. And this then becomes the standard Manichaean practice. So we actually have very few Manichaean texts, no complete text, very few fragments even, in Mani's original Aramaic. What we do have are texts in Middle Persian and Parthian and Sogdian and Uyghur Turkic and Chinese and Coptic and Greek and Latin, because wherever the Manichaeans went, they learned the local language and they translated Mani's writings, and they either translated or composed hymns and other texts they needed for their religious practice in that way. They did therefore promote literacy. In some of these cases, they developed or introduced writing systems that were more true to the spoken language than some of the more archaic writing systems that had been used, that carried over sort of scribal practices from thousands of years earlier, and you had to have a lot of training to be able to actually read it and know the words underneath the scribal signs. The Manichaeans introduced a more accessible kind of writing system, especially for the Iranian languages, and also for the Uyghurs who didn't have a literacy before the Manichaeans arrived. And so they made possible greater literacy. But Mani was also conscious of the fact that not everyone was going to be literate. And even when you're teaching people from a text, like in a classroom setting, it's good to have images, right? And so Mani commissioned a collection of images to accompany teaching, right? And so Mani's picture book is the way it's often called. And there's been recent research in the last decade or so to reconstruct what it contained. And we actually have some fragments which seem to be copies of the actual picture book, but then a lot of texts that refer to what was in the picture book. And so this was an aid for people who were less literate or illiterate, or who just, benefit, even though they're literate, from, visual cues to what they're being taught. So there was a very, conscious and deliberate plan of disseminating knowledge through text, through translation, through didactic images to help with teaching. And then they do seem to have been keen to have people learn and absorb the core teachings of Manichaeism, including its cosmology and other key ideas of what it had to offer.
Hmm. I mean, that's fascinating. I love learning about this stuff. So it's truly fascinating to me how, yeah, some people were like literacy is incredibly important, and how some people were like, it's okay, it's oral tradition, because oral tradition was very important in the ancient world to many, many places and cultures. So obviously, because a lot of places, I mean, it sounds like so, oh yes, they were promoting literacy, but also this is the ancient world we're talking about. And evidence remaining, again, is always a bit of a toss up of, do we have stuff, do we not?
Right.
And so, based geographically on where it was, now from my understanding of what we've been talking about, is that the religion seems to be stamped out earlier in the West than the East. So it sounds like it very much continued, especially in Asia. And so I'm curious, like, if we want to go find
Mm-hmm.
what remains of the any physical evidence of the texts and other things, where would one go? Can you go dig somewhere? Like, where, what sites do we look at? Do we look at stuff primarily in the Iranian plateau because that's more to the east, or do we have to go to like Asia itself? Is it just kind of spread through Central Asia? Yeah, where would we go?
Well, the most recent finds, so if we, let's say, for the last 30, 35 years, the most recent finds have been in Egypt and in China. So in Egypt, there's an oasis called the Dakhla Oasis, way off out of the Nile Valley. And there's an ancient city there called Kelis. And in the late 80s, early 90s, archaeological work was being done on the remains of what were sort of abandoned urban areas from the Roman period. And some Manichaean texts were found there. So that was completely fortuitous. No one went looking for them, right? It was just they were finding, of course, they were there alongside of other religious communities as well, but there were a set of houses where the Manichaeans clearly were, and they left, materials related to instruction and related to religious services, and as well as correspondence. Even more recently, there have been finds coming from China. Again, these are really fortuitous finds. It is not the case that anyone ever sort of set out and said, I'm going to look here for Manichaean things. All the great discoveries of the 20th century were either just general work on an archaeological site in which Manichaean remains were found alongside of those of other religious communities, or things on the antiquities market, right? So some of the Coptic texts from Egypt were codices which had been found by someone and taken to antiquities dealers, and then the Egyptian government inspectors came through and said, can't sell that, can't sell that, can't sell that, you can sell that, you can sell that. And then the things that they approved for sale ended up going to collections, for example, in the Chester Beatty Library, Dublin, and other places. But the Chinese material that's been coming out recently, first of all, there's a set of paintings, most of which at some historical phase, sometimes as early as the 16th century, had passed from China to Japan. And so in Japanese collections, we have Chinese paintings, which are actually Manichaean paintings from China. But then there are also these ritual handbooks, which have been found in villages in the southeastern part of China, Fujian. And that's a case of Chinese archaeologists knowing that there are Manichaean sites in the Fujian region, going around the local villages looking for anything that people might have in their family property or something that might be relics of other Manichaean activity in the region, and finding these sort of Chinese ritual manuals that were passed down in a family for a kind of Chinese folk religious practices of, prayers for health and good crops and good weather and things like that. And some of these contain whole sections that are Manichaean texts that we recognize from other finds we've got. So as far as Iran itself, as far as I know, there's only one tiny little bifolio, four pages total from a manuscript that was found among other artifacts in a dig somewhere in, I believe, sort of southwestern Iran. And this was maybe 15 years ago. And that's it from Iran, right? So Iran has not been a successful place to find very much Manichaean material, even though we know they were there for hundreds of years. It's just the circumstances and the luck of finds hasn't been as good in Iran as either Central Asia or China or Egypt has been.
It's interesting because a lot of these places where I feel like you might find preserved things, like Egypt, as you mentioned, a lot of the evidence, especially also which we have from Egypt itself, were aided by the fact that Egypt was just great for preservation conditions. I mean, it's desert, it's dry.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I was wondering while you were talking is going a little back to when you mentioned that it gained popularity with the Uyghur population.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly, and it was a very long time ago that I even learned about them, but I feel like they were quite nomadic being from more Central Asia. Now, I could totally be wrong, and you can totally tell me if I am wrong. But I wonder, like, some religions are very interested in kind of putting down roots, not only just like written stuff, but building sort of monuments for religious purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
one of these questions is, for Manichaeism, like, did they build did they have monasteries or monumental architecture or something? Or if it was not kind of, let's build a monumental thing, could sort of the nomadic tendencies of the people who took it and spread it as far as it could go, did that affect not really having or finding things and having them sort of spread where, oh, I found this accidentally because this is where, these nomads would have been and then they left. But hey, we have something here.
That's a very insightful question because it pulls together a lot of interesting things about the Manichaeans in Central Asia and China. The Manichaeans did have a kind of standard architecture called a manistan. And sometimes in the scholarship, people are a little careless and describe those as monasteries, but they're not monasteries. They're really kind of temple complexes. They're the places where people go for instruction. They go for various kinds of rituals that they do. They had a daily ritual meal that would be performed there. They had various kinds of fasts and confession rituals that they did there. So it's a ritual center, the Manistans. And so we do have references to Manistans, and we do have architectural remains of some Manistans in Xinjiang, autonomous region of People's Republic of China, in the Turfan region. And so we're able to actually, this archaeology was done in the early 20th century, and the sites are significantly degraded today, but we do have those archaeological reports and sketches. And so we have those. And then there is a surviving Manistan in Fujian, in southeastern China, relatively near the coast, that was later appropriated by local Buddhist community and now is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is celebrating the presence of the Manichaeans in China in that place. So we do have that architectural form that they used. But how the Uyghurs end up, because you're right, the Uyghurs were a nomadic horse herding and cattle herding population in what's now Mongolia and farther up into Siberia. But what happens is the Uyghurs get drawn in to the Chinese Civil War. So the Manichaeans are in China first, and then the Uyghurs get involved in the Civil War. This was an attempt to oust the Tang Dynasty, and the Uyghurs get pulled in. Each side tries to woo them into the Civil War, and they end up deciding to side with the Tang Dynasty and support it and uphold it. And they become key allies then of the Tang Dynasty in China. And it's in the Chinese capitals then, Chang'an and Luoyang, where the Uyghurs, in a much more urban environment where there are Manistans and the Manichaeans are there, that the Uyghur leader makes a very key contact. He might have had some prior contact, but we have texts that describe this moment as the moment when he decides he's going to bring Manichaean leaders back to the steppe, back to the nomadic empire, to spread Manichaeism among the Uyghurs. And they use that nomadic tribal organization, which is very characteristic of Central Asia. You know, everything is, the whole tribes are arranged in cohorts of, tens and hundreds, and there's a whole system of organizing the community for nomadic life. And the ruler of the Uyghurs uses that system as a channel of dissemination of Manichaeism to the population. There are some challenges for that because, for example, Manichaeans are in favor of vegetarianism, and it's not easy to be a vegetarian in the Central Asian steppe. So there are some references to those challenges in our sources and some jokes in the scholarship about it all, right? But what happens then is the Uyghur Empire eventually breaks up, and various Uyghur groups move south into more agricultural, settled, urbanized areas where there are a series of successor states to the Uyghur Empire, where several of them continue their Manichaeism there. And that's the sites from which we have the most archaeology and the texts and things, not from the steppe. There have been a few controversial things found in the steppe that people have promoted, both architectural features and sort of rock art features that people have pointed to and suggested these might be Manichaean, but so far they haven't persuaded a very large following to accept that. But it's always possible that we'll find something up in the steppe itself.
We can always hope, and there's a lot of land, I suppose, that has been not excavated for potential remnants. So maybe we will find something in the future, which would be very, very exciting. I don't know how fast work is going, but I'm going to just cross my fingers and say I hope. So, okay. I was trying to decide how to close the loop on this fantastic discussion. And I think what I want to do is sadly, womp, 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 talk about sort of the persecution and suppression that sort of ends, their presence really. And so we've established that in Rome in the West, the Roman emperors, let's see, during the 3rd century, that would have been what? Theodosius to Valentinian to who was emperor then? I think Valens might have been emperor in the 3rd. Oh gosh, I'm really not good with early 3rd century stuff. So I'm gonna hope that those emperors were somewhere around there.
Theodosius is involved. Theodosius is definitely involved.
Okay,
right?
good.
That's what happens in the West. Theodosius is the one who closes the door on the Manichaeans.
Okay. Because I was going to say, yeah, if we can just do a little comparison of, who are the major players who shut it down in the West and kind of what was their deal about, was it infringing just upon the rise of, Orthodox Christianity? And they were just like, no, this is incompatible versus Mani was, by all accounts, in Persia. We have the Sasanians. I'm trying to think, I think it was Shapur, right, who was the first emperor of the Sasanian Empire. So he must have, obviously, if this was all being created then and was allowed to exist during at least the first part of the Sasanian Empire, he was not super hostile to it. So who was it in Persia then who was like, no, we're going to stamp this out? Because I'm interested in, obviously, yeah, they ended at different times and the persecution was a bit different. But who are the main players? So for people who are like, yeah, I want to know how this ended, who was doing this?
Yeah, well, it's kind of ironic because the end is in the beginning, because Mani himself dies in prison in Iran, right? So you're right. Shapur was the monarch at the time that Mani was trying to get started, and at least for a time, Shapur was quite favorable. But then Bahram the First, who was one of Shapur's successors, is the one who has Mani arrested and imprisoned, and Mani dies in prison. But the Sassanids were not always hostile to the Manichaeans. There were various rulers along the way, Narsa, Shapur III, who are in the record as saying, the Manichaeans are fine, we have no problem with them. So there are periods of success and periods of persecution. In the West, Diocletian first, at the end of the 3rd century, tries to suppress Manichaeism because of tension between Rome and Persia, and sees the Manichaeans as kind of a 5th column out of Persia. But They survived that, and then Constantine comes in and opens up religious freedom in the Roman Empire. And so for about 70 years, the Manichaeans are fine. But then Theodosius comes along and says there's only one state religion, and we're going to start suppressing all the others. And the Manichaeans always seem to be the test case. Right? The Manichaeans are always the ones we're going to test out means of persecution on the Manichaeans first, and then when we get them, refined, we're going to go after other groups. And that's certainly true in the West. And then in the Middle East, when the Umayyads come in with the Islamic Empire, they're quite tolerant of the Manichaeans. But in 750, when the Abbasids come in, they say, okay, no more of this toleration. The Manichaeans do not count as people of the book. We're going to suppress them. But coincidentally, that's almost exactly within a couple of years of them being accepted by the Uyghurs. So there's a lot of movement of Manichaeans into Central Asia from the Middle East in that period. Then in Central Asia, the Uyghurs eventually the leadership decides to convert to Buddhism. So they stop sponsoring the Manichaeans. They probably actively appropriate Manistans and other material from the Manichaeans and transfer their ownership to the Buddhists that they're not going to support. There's no signs of like violent persecution, but clearly the power has shifted its support. And then even before that happens among the Uyghurs in China, the Manichaeans come in, and initially they get a degree of tolerance by the Chinese state. But then in the 840s, the Chinese government very famously starts to shut down all non-Chinese religions. And there again, they start with the Manichaeans and do them first, and then they turn on the Buddhists and start to suppress Buddhism in China. And so the 840s marked a turning point where Manichaeans had to flee to kind of the margins of state control. So a lot of them go up to the Uyghurs, and then some of them go south into southeastern China, where direct state control is not as firm as around the northern capitals. And so they find a kind of refuge in kind of the wilds of the southeast. And so that's where they are able to regroup and survive probably until the 1400s, 1500s in China. And that's the last place where they die out. And Marco Polo very famously stumbles upon a Manichaean community in Fujian that no one knew existed. And suddenly the government has to deal with, okay, what are we going to do with these Manichaeans? And at that time, it was the Yuan dynasty. It was the Mongols ruling China. And they just asked the Manichaeans, how do you want to be classified in our system? Because you're fine with us. And do you want to be under the Buddhists, or do you want to be under the Nestorian Christians, or how do you want to be, right? And so there's these interesting little stories of Manichaeans popping up in surprising places throughout history.
I mean, it's so fascinating. And I guess one of the big sort of takeaways from our conversation that I have is that this definitely geographically spans from the west to the east. This was a sort of long moving thing, as yes, of course, it's very sad when something that spread quite quickly suddenly goes away eventually. But, this is a lot of different geographical points, a lot of different languages are at play here. And finally, so if, more students would like to learn more about Manichaeanism, what would be your best suggestion to like help someone get started if they say, oh, I like the religious aspect, but I think I could bring in more because there's the cultural aspect, and you could look at the linguistic aspect, I suppose, if you really wanted to. So there's a lot of different places you could go. So just as like an expert yourself, how would someone start if they really had an interest?
I think the best advice I can give is to try to include Manichaeism in the bigger story that you might be interested in. So, for example, we're talking about Iranian history and culture. So wherever the Manichaeans go, they transmit Iranian ideas, Iranian literature, folklore. We have Coptic texts that tell stories that are only otherwise known from the Shahnameh, right? I mean, it's amazing. Iranian art. So, especially for those working in Iranian studies, the fact that there's very little Manichaeism from Iran itself should not be a deterrent, because certainly If you're studying the Iranian languages, you'll be able to work with the Manichaean texts in Parthian, Middle Persian, and Sogdian. So you can approach it from that angle. There are, a few places in North America where this can be done. UCLA, Irvine, these are good places to go. There's a lot of good places in Europe that you can work on the Iranian tradition and from that get into Manichaeism. But certainly there are, major works and classics in the field that you want to get started with. There's a good historical survey of Manichaeism by Samuel Liu. Not to be too egotistical, but there's my book on the Manichaean body, which is all about Manichaean disciplinary and ritual practices. There's Zsuzsanna Gulaci's work on Manichaean art. So bringing the Manichaeans into a broader interest in literature, in language, in culture, in art, this is the way I think to go. Rather than try to be a specialist in Manichaeism, make Manichaeans part of the story and use Manichaeans as a source of comparison or a piece of the evidence for these broader areas of study and research. That's what all of us who work in Manichaean studies have been trying to do, is not work in isolation, but not leave Manichaeans out of these broader historical and cultural stories that people want to research and recover.
I like how it seems like it is a discipline that demands being very interdisciplinary, which I do very much like because the ancient world is very interconnected. So we should study it as such and not just in little separate silos. So yeah, it seems perfect for that. Man, this has been such a great conversation. And I really, really, really wish we had time to keep going because I really have enjoyed learning about this. But
interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
I have two final questions that I have to get to. And the first one is, what, in your opinion, is the greatest legacy left to us from ancient Persia?
Wow, that's a huge question. The greatest legacy left from ancient Persia. There is a very rich literary tradition that spans, over 1,000 years and does not get its due in terms of how much it has helped shape and influence world literature. And we all know that we have certain biases, regional biases built into scholarship, and certainly above and beyond all else. I love Persian art and I love all kinds of things about Persia, but the rich literary heritage, the poetry, the religious literature is just a phenomenal legacy that certainly deserves to be held up alongside of sort of, European, Indian, Chinese literatures as one of the major world literary traditions, and really deserves more days in the sun than it's had so far.
I won't disagree with you there. And the second question I have is, what, in your opinion, would be the best legacy that we as scholars can leave for future students of Iranian studies?
To think with a disciplined mind. When we do ancient history, particularly, we're tempted to speculate a lot and to fill in gaps a lot. I think it's important to teach the methods of disciplined, evidence-based, cautious conclusions and not yield so much to the temptation to speculate, to date things that really can't be dated, to create whole chronologies of development based on very few pieces of evidence. Obviously there's a lot of content we like to teach, but more important than the content we teach is the discipline of historical research and how imagination is a danger. Imagination can carry you away and actually gives anything you produce in your research a shorter shelf life because it will be disproven as soon as new evidence is found. So stick to the material evidence, be cautious, be conservative in your conclusions, be happy building by baby steps our picture of the past.
Great advice. And I did kind of lie. There is one more question, but it's super simple. And that is, where can people find you if they would like to read your book, send you an email, ask about, I don't know, any questions they may have that I didn't ask about the Manichaeans? So, yeah.
You can always reach out to me at jason.bedoun@nau.edu. That's Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. That's where I am, and I'm always interested in hearing people who want to know more about these subjects.
Excellent. Well, I will link your faculty page and your email in the show notes so people can easily do that if they would like. And I would really just like to thank you for coming and talking to me today. This has been such a great morning. I'm learning so much.
Thanks, Lexi. You made it very fun.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a BeDuhn podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the BeDuhn Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at BeDuhn Institute and at BeDuhn UCLA, or visit our website, bededuhn.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the BeDuhn Institute, please email us at BeDuhnPodcastProduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.